Okay, so let's take this from the top. It's your friend and OBS just crashed, but I am back. We're going to watch the Stanford professor in his discussion about schizophrenia and react from my personal experiences with it. And I'd like to hear your reactions from your experiences as well. So let's go.
Some sort of weird grammatical imperialism that has emerged over the years. Again, what strikes me as like a totally depressing number: 90% of Earth's languages will disappear in the next century. Okay, so now we jump to our next topic, which is our first psychiatric disease. And to remind you from 2 days ago, we're not going to have a depression lecture. The depression chapter in the Zebra's book will tell all the same stuff in much better, more clear terms, I say, proving my point. And what you should do is read it with as much attention to it as if it has been a lecture subject. It is an important subject. Enough hints. Okay, so check that one out. What we focus on today, though, is schizophrenia. And we're going to take our same old strategy, starting off with what does the disease look like, and as you will see, all sorts of surprises in there, and then what goes on in the brain just before, early development, prenatal, genes, evolution, the whole deal there. We know this drill once again. So starting off, making sense of schizophrenia as a bunch of behaviors, you got to challenge right off the bat, which is lots of people use the word schizophrenic in an everyday sense that has no resemblance whatsoever to its actual technical use. Schizophrenic or schizzy, and we all know that one. We thought, my God, I am having such a schizzy day. I overslept. I missed my first class. It was terrible. I totally screwed up. But then I found out I got this great grade on a midterm, but then I had this fight with a friend, but then in the afternoon, and then this crashed, and blah, blah. God, what a schizoid day I'm having. No resemblance to how the term's actually used.
Yes, this is extremely common. I hear the term schizo quite a bit, and attached to things that have nothing to do with schizophrenia. So, what was that game? There's a really good horror game. I'll pull it out. It's very famous, but like the intro, in the very intro, it said, this guy went schizo and chopped up a bunch of people. Yes, so people use schizo in the wrong sense. So let's talk about what it really is. Hey Ray, thanks for all the rainbows.
That's not any sort of real term in psychiatry, whatever the schizy days are that we all experience now and then. Schizophrenia is something else. On the most technical level, schizophrenia is a disease of people where when you start talking to them, within 2 or 3 sentences, you realize there's something strange with their thinking. They're not thinking normally. They're not communicating normally. On the most fundamental level, that's what the disease is. Okay, obviously far more precise than that. Schizophrenia, disease of thought disorder, disease of inappropriate emotion, disease of inappropriate attribution of things, and what you'll see is this is not just some sort of generic craziness in the way that that word means nothing whatsoever. There are typical structures to the ways in which things are not working right in the behavior of schizophrenics, which we'll hear about in a bit. Part of what begins to bring that across is the obvious.
Thanks so much, Wraith, for bringing all the frogs that is allowed. I wish I could change the max character limit so that you could make pages and pages of Rainbow Frog. But in the meantime, thank you so much.
Fact that there's no way that schizophrenia is just one disease, because there's all sorts of subtypes.
Okay, I completely agree with this, that schizophrenia isn't just one disease. So schizophrenia has, it's defined by people having delusions and hallucinations and breaks with reality. But this can be caused by a ton of different things. So my relative, like my mother-in-law, she was psychotic for a straight year. And it turns out, once they did the test on her, she had a brain tumor. And they removed the brain tumor, and she wasn't psychotic anymore. So there can be lots of causes of psychosis. We're able to cure some of them now, but they keep coming up with different causes. NMDA, what's it called? Encephalitis. That was just discovered recently by a journalist who experienced it. Um, and she was going to get a schizophrenia definition, but what she really needed was um, certain infusions for her brain, and they treated that, and all her psychosis went away. So, yes, schizophrenia is long lasting psychosis. It can be caused by 5 bajillion different things that put you into long lasting psychosis. So, I'm with him on there are probably a ton of illnesses that we will discover over the years that are contributing to psychosis in people. Because back in the old days, when they didn't scan people's brains for brain tumors, people with brain tumors would be put in an asylum for the rest of their life. But now they can live their lives normally. All right, let's keep going.
It is a bunch of heterogeneous diseases. You
Also, let me know how my audio's doing, okay?
have a subtype paranoid schizophrenia, where what it's all about is thought disorder built around a sense of persecution. You have catatonic schizophrenia, where the person is in a frozen state, immobile for long periods of time. You have schizoaffective disorders, which is kind of a mixture of schizophrenia and depression disorders. It's not just one disease. So the whole sort of array of behavioral symptoms we're going to look at now, remember, some of them are more common in different subtypes than others. This is just the first broad overpass.
And this is a 15-year-old lecture, I believe. So back then, schizophrenia had categories, but then it just seemed like, I guess at least for me, that I fit in multiple categories. So definite paranoid schizophrenia, but also definite catatonia of staying in the same place, not being able to move for days. So yes, there's multiple causes, and it can look different in different people. But Wraith, you said a slow build aneurysm. Let me know what that involves. Were they able to treat it?
So beginning to make sense of the disease. What it is, above all else, is a disease of cognitive abnormalities, of abnormal sequential thought. And the term that's given for it is loose associations. All of us can tell a story where we have a pretty good ability to put it sequentially and have the facts go in a way where it will make sense to any other listener. You do not see this in schizophrenics. Sequential thinking is greatly impaired. And instead of having logical sequences of information that they give, things tangent all over the place, bouncing around all over, where in retrospect, you can kind of see how they might have gotten from A to Z, although most people would have gone from A to B at that point. The tangential thinking being another term for it, the loose associations. So what do you wind up seeing there? You get schizophrenics, for example, who get terribly confused in a sentence, whether when they are hearing about boxers, they are unable to keep straight within one sentence to separate out whether they're talking about a dog or they're talking about an occupation, because they slip back and forth between the two. Confusion between being a caddy, someone who golf, whatever, and a Cadillac, short term for that. All sorts of ways in which they can't hold on to the sequential logic, and instead there's just this tangenting getting.
So I agree with what he's saying here, but just wanted to say that this is when I am untreated, when I am in psychosis, that my speech is especially impaired. But when I am not in psychosis because I'm taking 40 meds, like now, I can speak better. I can speak okay. And I get less, and loose associations, I make them all the time. Things that people call coincidences, to me, I feel like they're messages. And Wraith, You had a pinhole-sized brain bleed from an injury. Holy crud. Oh, dang, Wraith. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But thank you for sharing that, because again, it shows that there's so many different causes of psychotic illness. And I'm really glad they can clear most of it up for you. That's awesome.
Caught up in the loose associations. You're talking about a boxer. If you're schizophrenic, you're talking about a particular boxer, you follow that sport, whatever, and suddenly you're expressing an opinion about how that person would do in a ring against a St. Bernard. And you're often talking about dogs from there, just getting caught by a loose association between the sound of the word and its multiple meanings, going off the tracks on that. So the loose associations. Next, you have a consistent one with abstraction. All of us have a pretty good intuitive sense when someone is telling us a story. Is this meant to be literal reporting of events in a sequential way? Is this meant to be a parable? Is this meant to be a somewhat secondhand through the grapevine story? We have a very good sense of how concrete or how abstract the information that we're getting is. Schizophrenics are terrible at that. They have no intuition to get the right level of abstraction. And schizophrenics always skew in the same direction, which is to interpret things far more concretely than is actually the case. And that's the term that...
And this is interesting to me because this is also common in autism. So we speak about concrete, we're much more about concrete things than abstract stuff's very hard. I couldn't do college because I could memorize and do equations, but I couldn't write a paper because that involved too much abstract thinking for me.
That's used in the business, concreteness of thought, which is having a lot of trouble doing the more abstract process of seeing things on a metaphorical level, things of that sort. So here's a standard sort of test you would give to someone if you think they're schizophrenic. You give them an association task, and you say something like, okay, can you tell me what do these things have in common? An apple, an orange, and a banana. And they'll say, all of them are multisyllabic words. You'll say, okay, well, that's great, that's true, but anything else they have in common? Yep, all of them have letters that involved closed loops. Just getting caught up in the most concrete possible level of interpretations of it, not able to step back and do any sort of abstracting. You see this in all sorts of other ways. Therapist will
welcome in.
meet the patient and say something like, so what's on your mind today? And they'll say, my hair, in this very literal sort of way. Or you'll say, can I take your picture, holding a camera? And they'll say, I don't have a picture to give you. This very literal sense again. Or things like, you would sit down as schizophrenic with a piece of paper and a pen and say, just as part of what we're doing here, can you write a sentence for me? Any sentence. And then you look at what they've written, which is a sentence for me, any sentence. And then you say, no, actually, that's not what I mean. I mean, can you come up with a sentence, and when you've thought of that sentence, write it. And they'll write the word it, because they can't get out of the concreteness of saying, could you write a sentence? Can you write, a sentence? They're caught up in the concrete level of that.
Yeah, again, I'd like to emphasize that this is also very common in autism. It's not just in people with psychotic illness. I have trouble with this. I may sound like I don't, but the worse I am off if I'm struggling. I very much take everything somebody says very, very literally. Things like if somebody says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" This was like had some confusion between me and my partner. Like, "Is there anything I can do for you?" I would just say like, um, um, sorry, I'm not doing very well. Um, But yes, I'm trying to take less benztropine so I can remember things better for you guys. But yes, I do get caught up in concrete thinking and have trouble interpreting metaphor. I don't understand when people are trying to get me to leave, which can cause a lot of problems for me. If they don't say goodbye, I don't know the conversation is over. Yes. So I have a lot of concrete thinking. Though when I'm well medicated, I can grasp a lot more.
A way that always pops up, one of the classic types of tests that's done is called proverb tests. Proverbs, by definition, they are metaphorical, they are parables, they are abstract, and we all know intuitively that when you're talking about birds of a feather flock together, you're doing something sort of symbolic about the well-known homogamy of lips width and people and who they choose to marry and the similarities. Yes, birds of a feather flock together, it's talking about like tend to assort with like. Give proverbs to schizophrenics and they can't get out of the most concrete level of interpretation of it. So you sit them down.
Okay, and yes, I can have trouble getting beyond the concreteness of certain things, but let's see, I, I forget. Here we go.
And you say, okay, tell me what this means. A rolling stone gathers.
Oh, okay. It's because I tend to think that there's a second language being spoken underneath the first language. So when they say birds of a feather flock together, I tend to make not just like the concrete image of it, but I also think in my mind they're trying to convey to me that I need to make better friends. Secretly through their second language.
No moss. And we all know that people are on the move, don't make emotional connections, there's a detachment, whatever. And they're often saying stones rolling down hills, it's very hard for plants to grow on them. It's very hard because the surface tends to be smooth, and then on top of it, if it's rolling, you got like this angular motion that will trip. So it's very hard for moss to grow on stones. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen that happen, and I've seen many stones, and on the most concrete possible level, incapable of pulling it back to the level of
Okay, and he mentioned parables. I know when Jesus was making a parable in the Bible, when he said, if your left eye causes you to sin, like cut it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than to lose your whole soul. And so when I was really sick, I thought I didn't see the parable. I saw that I need to remove my eye. And that's what got me hospitalized. And yes, that got me hospitalized.
abstraction. Consistent feature of this. Here, a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist came
Oh, and
up.
also, as I'm saying that this is common with autism, people at autism are at very much higher risk for psychosis than the general population. So this person may have an autism diagnosis as a child and then eventually get a schizophrenia diagnosis as an adult.
With what has to be one of the all-time
So I guess most people with autism don't have schizophrenia, but a lot of people with schizophrenia do have autism, from what I've seen.
great proverb tests for figuring out if someone has the remotest tendency towards schizophrenic concreteness. There was an abstract phrase, sort of proverb, that was very popular, that was very prevalent in the United States during World War II. It was up on posters in all the post offices, places like that, and it was a way of abstractly telling people, be careful the information you put in letters that you were sending off to loved ones who were off at war, because it may inadvertently wind up in the wrong hands and could carry information that could be extremely damaging to the war effort. Okay, do people know what it is? Loose lips sink ships. Loose lips sink ships, wonderfully abstract notion. Try sitting down a schizophrenic and saying, what does it mean when you say loose lips sink ships? And suddenly there's this imagery of ships being capsized by big lips coming out of the water and things of that sort, because it can only be dealt with on the very concrete level. What else? More symptomatology. Delusions, belief in things that cannot be, belief in having participated in historical events that cannot be. You're sitting there interviewing a schizophrenic and they suddenly say, have you heard of the Great Wall of China? And you will say, well, yes, in fact, I have. And they'll say, my idea, my idea. The generals came to me at night with a map and I said, this is where it goes. This is probably not what happened. Delusional thought, inserting yourself conversations with people who no longer exist. Related to that is the paranoia, which of course is most florid in paranoid schizophrenia, but it is a frequent theme. What do apples, oranges, and bananas have in common? They're all wired for sound. If the fruit is listening to you, this makes for a rather disquieting life. And almost certainly it has something to
That
do
was a
with
funny
if
joke,
the world is
but
making
yes, it's true.
so little sense to you, it is a world that is very threatening. Along with that, most famously perhaps with schizophrenia, is you get hallucinations. Those are the defining features. Somebody is trying to figure out if somebody in an emergency room has come in with some sort of schizophrenic type disorder and hear that the person is hearing voices, and that pretty much nails down the diagnosis. For reasons that are very poorly understood, the vast majority of hallucinations are auditory. However, there's all sorts of notions with that. One great theory coming from our own Patrick House, given 2 years ago, which is you get auditory hallucinations more often than visual ones because we're more accustomed to visual stuff in the world, having fragmented vision. You're seeing it across two mirrors, reflections, things of that sort. We are more vulnerable towards sounds not making sense. Vast majority of hallucinations in schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations. When we see in a little while.
Okay, and so they will say that they're mostly auditory hallucinations. For me, that's different. I tend to have visual and tactile hallucinations. Like I feel like I physically feel that the ivy from the tree I see outside is growing into my veins, and it hurts very much, and I don't like it. I get very upset. So that feeling, so I have a lot of feeling based and a lot of vision based, and then I have a lot of that are just entire scenarios. Like for one example, I went into got up to make coffee for the group because I thought that's what I was supposed to do at the clinic. But the lady leading the discussion was mad about that. She wanted me to be sitting down and listening to her. And so everybody in the class turned towards me and snapped their fingers over and over again because they know that the loud sound of snapping their fingers would upset me and punish me for having gotten out of my seat. So it's like, that's not just auditory, it's visual, it's an entire situation sometimes. Yeah, and you got diagnosed with autism after schizophrenia. That happens too.
What the neurochemistry is of hallucinations, by all logic, what they should be is just random splatters of noise and random visual dots and all of that. Instead, they're structured. They have content. People hear voices rather than random sound. People see very structured hallucinations, sufficiently so that researchers can even do studies as to which are the most common voices heard by schizophrenics. And no surprise, in Western cultures forever and ever, the number one voice on the hit parade is that of Jesus. The number two voice, Satan. The number three, typically whoever is the head of state in the country at that point. It's structured to that extent that you can publish papers about what the hallucinations are like. There's all sorts of structure sort of underneath. It is not just disordered thought, it's loose associations and tangenting and concreteness and structured hallucinations. What else? Another feature of the schizophrenic symptoms is social withdrawal.
Yep.
And schizophrenia, everybody thinks of as a disease of abnormal thought. It is a disease of abnormal social affiliation. And you look at a schizophrenic.
And you'll see that there's very few influencers who are schizophrenic. We tend to be withdrawn. I'm very withdrawn in general. You guys, talking to you guys has helped me a whole lot, because otherwise I am very withdrawn and don't talk to people.
Schizophrenic in, some village in who knows where in the Amazon or in Bloomington, Indiana, and this is going to be someone who is somewhat ostracized and socially disconnected, very much alone. It is not just a disease of disordered thought. More and
Yes, and that part of it was my paranoia. I kept thinking people were betraying me, and so I cut them off. And before I got diagnosed with schizophrenia, I would have psychosis, but it was occasional and it wasn't strong enough for me to be hospitalized. So yes, I would just know my friend was betraying me behind my back without even talking to them or talking to anybody. And I realized I had to gossip about them first before they gossiped about me and got me fired. So this led to some really bad social relationships and the loss of some relationships that I really valued and that I miss. Because those friends, we would be dear friends for a year, and then I would go into psychosis and I would see them as a threat or that they are betraying me, and I would cut them off completely.
more people are realizing the core with schizophrenia is the disordered thought. The standard view has always been to hone in on the most florid feature of the disease. Schizophrenia is the disease where you hallucinate, where you hear voices. And the vast majority of the neuropharmacology research that's been done out there on the disease is meant to go and cure the hallucinations. But far less responsive to any of the drugs are the tangenting thought, the concreteness, the loose associations, more and more people thinking that that's really the core of what the disease is about.
And a lot of those, they divide schizophrenia into positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive doesn't mean good. Positive means a symptom that adds something to you, and the negative symptom is something that is taking away from you. So the positive symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. They're something added to me. But then what I most of the time struggle with, and I know a lot of people do, is the negative symptoms where things are taken away from me. My focus, my ability to think about metaphor and concreteness, and my ability to move, a lot of things like that. And yes, we like on TV, we like having the schizophrenic character do something awful or interesting, at least, because of their hallucinations. When in real life, most of us just sort of sitting on our couch freaked out about something.
More features of it, which is the whole world of the social withdrawal. Apathy. What we're beginning to see is a dichotomy in the business. Positive symptoms in schizophrenia, paranoia, loose thoughts, hallucination, all of that. Negative symptoms of schizophrenia,
But he's going into that,
the absence of social connectedness, the absence of affect.
I have trouble. I have very flat affect. I make this character smile.
Physiologic.
I make this character smile because I don't smile. I can try. It just comes across as inauthentic. Yes, so flat affect. That definitely happens to me. That's part of why I use an avatar, because I don't want, though maybe one day I'll start to make it me as a real person, I don't know. But yes, have the avatar to smile, to show emotion, and to have like eyes that look at you when my eyes in real life don't look at people.
Typically, you see some damping of autonomic nervous system in schizophrenics, so the positive and the negative symptoms of the disease. Last couple of features of it. One is the notion that, of course, schizophrenia has something to do with violence. Everybody knows that there is the scenario lurking out there that occurs endless number of times, which is you have some psychiatrically unstable individual turning out to have schizophrenia who winds up doing something horribly violent, the danger of schizophrenics cracking and going postal, and every now and then something like that happens. 20 years ago, there was a horrifying incident at Berkeley, a student there who was schizophrenic and probably should not have been there at the point because he was not well medicated. Something cracked, and he took a bunch of Berkeley students, women, hostage in a bar in Berkeley, did all sorts of horrific sexually abusive things there before he killed himself after killing a few of them. This is what happens when something like that occurs with a schizophrenic. Oh my God, so we've got all these people running around where that could be happening any second. Schizophrenics are far less dangerous than are normal individuals in society. The rates of violence are extremely low, with one exception, which is schizophrenics being violent in damaging themselves, self-injury, a huge feature of schizophrenia.
Yeah, so we see that again is again extremely low rates of us committing violence. But self-harm is very common. But yes, I'm just a girl sitting on a couch. I'm not somebody that would hurt anybody. But self-injury, yep, like I sort of told you about my eye.
Part of the delusions, part of the thought
Because you'll feel
disorder,
like God's
part
telling
of the
you to.
despair, when every now and then your head clears enough to see what the rest of it is like. And there are even studies as to which are the most popular places in the body that are mutilated in schizophrenics. Genitals are top on the list, and going down from there. Horrific thing that happened also about 20 years ago, Columbia Medical School. And this was an individual, a student there, with a history of a lot of psychiatric instability and schizophrenia, and somewhat well controlled with meds. And somewhere in the third year, when starting the clinical rotations, the various stressors of it, the person kind of unraveled. Probably should not have been there in the first place, but nonetheless had a schizophrenic break and had withdrawn from med school and was sitting at home. Part of his paranoia, part of his delusions were that he was satanically possessed, and specifically the way Satan was driving him to madness was with obsessive sexual thoughts. So being a relatively
yeah, obsessive sexual thoughts a lot of times are hallucinations and delusions can focus around sexual things, and that leads to even more awkward and difficult situations.
Well-trained endocrinologist, because we know better than him at this point how it works, he decides, how do I make those thoughts go away? Let me get rid of my testosterone. So
Welcome
he
back,
castrated himself.
Misoksu.
But at least being well-trained in one domain of endocrinology, he knew that other fact we've had in here, which is that the adrenal glands also make a certain degree of testosterone. And he proceeded to try to adrenalectomize himself. He sterilized with some alcohol. He made an incision without anesthetic. He had a mirror there angled to be able to see what he was doing. And at one point, he hit a blood vessel, which started bleeding, and he went to the ER at Columbia Presbyterian, going in there, not saying to his former classmates, oh my God, guys, can you help me? Look what I've done. I'm saying instead, hi guys, I'm trying to take out my adrenals and I'm having a problem here with it. Can you give me a hand?
Okay, yep, I have done this.
This is very disordered thought. This is a very elegant version of it. Schizophrenic self-injury, schizophrenic suicide is anything but clean. Number one on the list, genitals. Number two for women, female schizophrenics, breasts. Number three, thighs. On it goes. This brings up another feature of the disease. which is back in the 1960s when all sorts of laudable things happened along certain cultural lines. There amid that was one horrifically damaging, idiotic thing that emerged in psychiatry at the time, which was a sort of, minority view in psychiatry, a lunatic fringe view that basically schizophrenia is not so bad. Schizophrenia has all sorts of hidden blessings. And soon it had frameworks of things like schizophrenia is the disease of being healthy in a crazy world. Schizophrenia is the disease of having insights into life that other people can't. And psychiatrists at the time, one of them, a man named Ronald Lang, who became famous for this, for arguing it's not a disease, we shouldn't be medicating, we shouldn't be hospitalizing, it's a bunch of blessings. And it is even...
Okay, yes, this idea is common. People will be like, back in the olden days, you would have been called a shaman. This is not true, at least from my experience. If I were a shaman of a village, I would command the villagers not to drink any water because it's all poisoned and we would all die of dehydration. So, no, schizophrenia doesn't make you a shaman.
Continue to this day. The quote that I put on the top of the handout, Andrew Weil, who's one of the gurus of sort of complementary medicine, and as you'll see, an absolutely ridiculous statement there along the lines of the hidden blessings of schizophrenia. There were movies at that time. King of Hearts was one very popular one about somebody having to hide from the police or who knows what in the asylum, and eventually releasing the schizophrenics who were so much saner than the other people around, and heartwarming. And all you need to do is be schizophrenic or know someone who is or have a family member, and you will see there are no hidden blessings. This is not a disease of hidden compensations and more...
Yeah, I have not had a lot of benefits from this disease.
Insight into the world. This is one of the most horrific ways that biology can go wrong, and one of the best demonstrations of it is half of schizophrenics attempt suicide. And
yes.
The more often you have periods of...
Okay, and this is common, I know, at least in my case, is that I think that there's all these different puzzles in this world. And I think all these coincidences are these puzzles I'm putting together. And then for some reason, the solution to the puzzle is taking my life so I can go on to the next world. But, so it's very tempting with this illness, because it seemed there were times in my life when it was like, oh, that's just what I'm supposed to do. It's not bad. It's just the answer to it's the answer to the riddle. It's the answer to the puzzle. It's how I become my next phase of individual. So if any of you guys think that, I'm sorry you're going through it, and just know that suicide is not the answer.
Remission.
Also, I need to know how to say things so that my videos don't get flagged for stuff like saying that. Let's just say like SH or something.
The more likely you are to commit suicide. What's the significance of that? The more often you have periods where you're clear-headed enough to see what your life is like the rest of the time, the more likely you are to try to kill yourself. A disease with no hidden blessings whatsoever. Other features of it. There's an aging component, two different forms. First one is, as schizophrenics become older, elderly, what you see is the positive symptoms tend to disappear. The hallucinations get damp, the delusions, the loose associations, and the negative symptomatology is what comes to the forefront, this world of just flat affect and withdrawal. The other age feature of it, we will hear about in a bit, which is real defining, which is schizophrenia is a disease where in the vast majority of the sufferers, it has late adolescence, early adulthood onset. It is a disease of 18-year-olds who come down with the diagnosis for the first time.
This is true for biological males. There's been more studies of this recently, probably after he made this lecture. that oh yes, females actually tend to get diagnosed late 20s to early 30s, while males tend to get diagnosed, biological males tend to get diagnosed from age like late teens, early 20s.
Time. If you make it to age 30 without schizophrenia, you have virtually no chance of ever having it.
Not
It is a
true unless
disease of
you're if you
adolescent
are a female.
onset. And this is going to fit with two things we'll be talking about. One is the epidemiological evidence show.
A lot of the studies were just done on male. It was considered a male disease, but now that they're including women in the studies, they're seeing that there are differences in how we experience it.
That what schizophrenic breaks typically are at the very beginning are in response to major stressors. These are individuals who have always been a little bit odd, who in elementary school had imaginary playmates far later than most other kids did, who had all sorts of periods where they seemed not to be paying attention and lost in their own thoughts, who had trouble making friends, but they were okay. They were sort of hanging on. And then it was late in high school when they had the car accident, or the first boyfriend was so horrible to them, or the parent died, or whatever the crisis was, and this person who was just sort of holding on, that's where the dip occurs. That's where it crashes. Schizophrenia as an adolescent onset disease where stress plays a major precipitating role.
It was a major precipitating role for me as well. I was mourning the loss of somebody. It was a very intensely stressful situation, and that's when I broke with reality.
The other piece that we'll see is the fact that schizophrenia almost certainly is heavily anchored in the frontal cortex. Frontal cortex. You remember the frontal cortex. Frontal cortex, which is not fully mature until age 25 or so. The last big burst of frontal maturation, late adolescence, early adulthood. We'll see there's lots of reasons to think that schizophrenia is a disease where around late adolescence, a fragile, vulnerable frontal cortex gets kicked once too hard with something or other, and that's where the problems emerge. Couple of other features. Demography in every culture ever looked at on Earth, 1% to 2% of the population comes down with it. No gender differences, no socioeconomic status differences in terms of who becomes schizophrenic. But once you are, there is the not very surprising downward socioeconomic spiral, which is no surprise. People who are schizophrenic do not make very good CEOs of large corporations. These are the street people. These are the homeless. The majority of people living on streets in this country are individuals who are schizophrenic, not alcoholic. That is the far more common thing that you...
Yes, so people tend to look at homeless people as addicts, or because then people can, I guess, say, oh, you did this to yourself or something. But actually, it's a lot of people that are acting strange. It's not from drugs, it's just from this disease.
You see. So a disease of complete collapse into some of the least cared for sort of strata of society, that is part of the demographics as well. So that's what the disease looks like. And if you're really thinking about these symptoms, at this point, you should be jumping out of your chair because of something really disturbing about this collection of symptoms. Okay, so what is schizophrenia? It's a disease of thinking abnormally. This is a disease of thinking differently from everyone else. This is a disease of thinking in a way that everyone else thinks isn't right, and suddenly we are skating on thin ice of this transitioning from a world of neuropsychiatric disorders and medicine into a world of all sorts of hidden agendas of abuse. And psychiatry has been hand in hand in bed with all sorts of ideologues over the decades, over the years, in willing to hand out diagnoses of schizophrenia to political dissidents, to people you want to get rid of.
Yes, we did this in the U.S. We did this to Black people. We also did this to, and then in the in certain countries right now, I won't like give their name, but if you're a political dissident, they will diagnose you. They will say you must be crazy. So they will diagnose you with schizophrenia, load you up on meds so that you can't even really talk much, and then they don't have that political dissident causing them problems anymore. But that person wasn't schizophrenic. They just disagreed with the government.
And this is a totally loaded diagnosis when, most fundamentally, this is a disease of everybody else thinks you're not thinking normally. Because some of the time that describes a florid psychiatric disease that destroys your life, and some of the time it describes people who are just a pain in the ass, and some of the time it describes people who are going to transform the world by thinking differently. How can you possibly approach this disease in an objective way rather than it having just shot through with ideology? And one of the ways in which this can happen, one of the ways where you get some grounding in it, is to look at what the disease appears like in other cultures. Because you begin to see the commonalities, and this begins to impress you with the notion that there is, in fact, a core set of dysfunctions to the disease. So let me tell you about the one case of cross-cultural schizophrenia I've ever been exposed to. And I was going to bring slides, but I couldn't quite figure out how to scan them. So maybe 8 years from now, I'll get it together for that technology. But it has to do with the time I spent in Africa and my nearest neighbors. Nearest neighbors there are from a tribe called the Maasai. These are nomadic pastoralists, and these are not the folks next door. This is as different of a culture as you could find on this planet. Men around puberty, boys around puberty, become warriors, spend the next 10 years in their warrior clans, as we've heard about, pillaging the neighbors, getting killed in return around age 25. As elders, they settle down and marry their first wife, typically a 13-year-old, and will, as soon as they can, add on more. This is a culture with, up until recently, a life expectancy in the 30s. This is a culture where people believe in all sorts of things that we would view as being paranormal. This is a culture in which people celebrate events by drinking tureens of cow blood. This is a very different bunch of folks. Let me tell you about the one schizophrenic Maasai who I've ever seen. And this was about 25 years ago, and I was in my camp, which was a few miles away from this one village where I knew a lot of folks, and just sitting there minding my own business. And I had this one woman in there who was sort of my closest friend or whatever in the village, and I suddenly see she is running up the mountain with a bunch of the other women from the village in this completely agitated state. They come roaring into my camp, totally flummoxed and just like completely agitated. These are people who do not get agitated over things very readily. These are people who, as a puberty rite, have to go out and kill a lion or don't come back. So when Maasai are getting all crazed about something, this is something worth paying attention to. They're totally crazed, and they're saying somebody in the village has done something very wrong, and I need to come and help them. Turns out what they wanted me to do was bring my car. That's the way in which I was going to be helpful. So they impressed me into doing this, and we all pile into the car and start driving down and heading towards the village. And as we're getting there, I'm beginning to get some information. And what I see is them telling me about a woman in the village who's done something wildly inappropriate, and they've had it with her. Now, I had been around that area for about 4 years at that point, knew most of the people in that village, and this was someone who I had never encountered. Aha, socially isolated, living in the back of some hut at the far corner of the village, a first sort of hint. Okay, so they're describing to me that she has done something inappropriate. She has killed a goat. You don't do that. You don't do that if you are a woman. You don't do that if it is not a ceremony. You don't do it the way she has done it. She has grabbed somebody's goat and ripped its throat open with her teeth and was now there with the goat, and everybody had had it with her. So we're driving there, and I'm listening to this, and I'm saying, whoa, and this sounds like a psychotic break. this is going to be cool. This is going to be really interesting. I wonder what it'll be like to talk to the family and find out sort of what the symptoms have been. Or I wonder if she's going to have any insight. It's going to be fascinating to talk to her about this. So I get into the village, and this person I was now planning to have some good heart-to-hearts with about their tangential thinking, out comes this huge naked woman with a goat in her mouth by the throat, covered in goat blood and goat urine and goat shit, and this woman gives this howling yell, charges across the village, knocks me over, and attempts to strangle me. I'm a normal kind of guy. You know, normal sort of fantasy life, and that kind of, never once in the darkest recesses of my mind did this strike me as something that was appealing. I'm lying there, she's throttling me. I'm thinking, this is how I'm going to wind up dying. My poor parents are going to have to deal with the stigma of this for the rest of their lives, that this is he's done in by someone with a goat in her mouth. And thinking this, so fortunately everybody else was much more clear-headed, and they pull her off me, and what they proceed to do is push her into my Jeep. And they pile on top of her and they say, let's go. So I collect myself and leap in, and we head off driving there. And this woman was floridly out of control there. But, you know, we're driving somewhere. Where are we driving? We're driving to the nearest government clinic, which was about 25 miles away and consisted of a wood shack and a nurse there, a government nurse, who, as a result of his 3 weeks of training, gave out malarial medication for anything you came to complain about. And what they were going to do was they wanted to get rid of her. So we go driving, and we eventually get to this clinic where what they proceed to do is push her into the hut and hammer the door closed. So I'm sitting there at this point saying, okay, well, we've containment. So what do we do now? Do we talk to her, or does the nurse talk to? Do we go and get the family? What do you? So I turn to my friends and I say, so what do we do now? And they say, let's get the hell out of here. Showing an important thing. Even in a culture as different from ours, nobody has a whole lot of tolerance for the mentally ill. Let's get out of here. So they persuade me to go. We get into the vehicle and start the long drive back. After a while, you know, the car's aired out a bit and everybody's calming down a bit, and I decide this was wonderful. What a marvelous opportunity to learn about some cross-cultural psychiatry or whatever. So I turn to my friend who's sitting next to me there, and I say, so what do you think was wrong with that woman? And she looks at me as if I'm an idiot. She says, she's crazy. And I said, well, how do you know? How do you know? And she said, she hears voices. I say, you guys hear voices. Maasai hear voices. They do trance dancing before they do sort of these around-the-clock cattle runs. They hear voices of ghosts, that sort of thing. I say to her, what's the big deal? You hear voices? And she says, no, 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 it's different. Then I say, well, what else was she doing wrong? And she says, she killed a goat. And I say, you guys kill goats, but again, this wasn't how it's done. There is an old, long-standing belief among Maasai men that it is very bad luck to have women observe you eating meat, so they get to go off on their own and eat all the goat meat, and it's done in a certain ritualized way. You do not kill a goat if you are a woman, if you are a naked, yelling banshee of a woman in the middle of the village with your bare hands and teeth. You don't do this. So I'm sitting there, and I'm saying, well, you know, it's kind of hard for me to tell the difference here. And
yeah, so this sort of shows why people's idea of like, oh, schizophrenia has so many great traits, like you just think in a spiritual way and you see spiritual things, you're like a shaman. If you were in a different culture, people would treat you very well. But it turns out, no, even in these tribal societies where people experience these dreams and stuff like that, the schizophrenic person is ostracized.
She says, in a sense, idiot, she hears voices at the wrong time. And that's the core, ultimately, of the objectivity that's needed in this disease. In order to understand what counts as abnormal thought, you first have the huge challenge of understanding all the different ways that normal thought can manifest itself. And that is a classic problem in training psychiatrists sitting in some inner city clinic, recognizing that the amount of cultural variety there, the different ways in which you can be normal, is extraordinary and extraordinarily challenging at times. You are on very thin ice deciding you know what counts as abnormal thinking before you have a very wide sense of what can count as normal. Okay.
Hey, Mercy.
So now let's take a 5-minute break, and all sorts of very accomplished artists over the years who've turned out to be schizophrenic, and schizophrenia is not what made their creativity possible. Schizophrenia is what destroyed their careers. Other question is, so what happened to that woman? And this was shortly before I was coming back to the States, and it was about 9 months later that I went back there, and at some point when seeing my friends saying, whatever happened to that woman? And her response was, oh, she died. Masai do not like to stay indoors. She died. That's all I ever found out. Once again, as different of a culture on Earth as you can imagine, and they are no more tolerant of the mentally ill than we are. So now, beginning the neurochemistry of it. What's going on in the brain? What's going on with brain chemistry? And for decades and decades, there has been one dominant model for schizophrenia, which is the dopamine hypothesis. The notion that somewhere in the brain, stay tuned, there is an excess of dopamine winding up in the synapses. What's the evidence for it? First off, you do things like look at levels of dopamine breakdown products in the bloodstream, in the urine and the cerebrospinal fluid, tending to be elevated in schizophrenics. Next, what you see is the most important fact, which is all of the classic drugs that work with schizophrenia block dopamine receptors. Antipsychotic drugs, neuroleptics, Haldol, Thorazine, when it's some exciting moment in the, made.
There's since been some new meds, Caplyta, Cobenfy, that I forget what I was saying.
For TV movie where the person has gone mad in the ER and someone yells for a syringe, they're yelling for a syringe of something that will block the dopamine receptors.
Okay, the dopamine. Yes. So yes, dopamine theory has been pretty prominent, but there are some new meds now that are working on some different things. So there's some progress being made there.
If you give schizophrenics dopamine, or some drug that activates dopamine receptors, their symptoms get worse, which kind of makes you wonder who approved that kind of study. That doesn't sound very logical. You look post-mortem at the brains of schizophrenics, and there's elevated levels of dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex. So we have a whole bunch of ways that things can go wrong. We can have too much dopamine coming out for some reason or other. We can have too many dopamine receptors, enhanced sensitivity. And we know another possible way, which is dopamine is then broken down by this enzyme. And if this enzyme isn't working very well, levels are going to accumulate. And there's a bit of evidence of abnormalities of this enzyme in some individuals. So one additional interesting piece of evidence for this dopamine hypothesis, which seems absolutely clear by now. You have somebody who's schizophrenic, you give them a drug that blocks dopamine receptors and thus decreases dopaminergic signaling, and they start getting better. What's your hypothesis have to be? I bet you they had too much dopamine. This is shown in another interesting way. 18 counties over in the brain from where dopamine's got something to do with this, dopamine serves another role.
Okay, and yes, it could be the dopamine theory could be correct, but there's 1/3 of all schizophrenics don't respond to medication. So that leads me to think that, yes, 2/3 respond to dopamine, but that 1/3 that doesn't, it again makes me feel like these are different diseases. These are not from the same source. Because yes, the antipsychotics do not work for 1/3 of people. They thought I was medication resistant originally when I had my first episode for a year and a half. But eventually I found something that worked for me.
In a motor system related to the basal
Okay, the
ganglia,
motor
all of
system is
that
also the problem. So we tend to have movement disorders because of the dopamine medications. They cause our faces to twitch and our legs to move, and you feel very stressed out. Your whole body can tense up. Unfortunately, the dopamine that we're using to treat the schizophrenia is also used in movement. And so for many people, you start to have weird movement after taking these meds.
Involved in fine motor control, a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And if you get a little bit of damage there, I think I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, you get the tremor of old age. If you get a lot of damage there, you got yourself Parkinson's disease. And what occurs in Parkinson's is 90% of the neurons in the substantia nigra die. And people are even beginning to understand why. These are dopaminergic neurons. Parkinson's is a disease of losing all the dopamine signaling in this part of the brain. People began to figure this out in the early 60s, and out of that came one of the first drug treatments for any neurological disease. What's the strategy? These are people who have too little dopamine in this part of the brain. Give them replacement dopamine. Turns out it's hard to get dopamine in the brain, so you would give people one step earlier in the biosynthesis a drug called L-DOPA. L-DOPA, which then gets converted into dopamine, and this was miraculous. All sorts of people who were just paralyzed with their Parkinson's, L-DOPA suddenly liberated them. There was a movie, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, called Awakenings, with Robin Williams, which was based on a book by Oliver Sacks, based on his own work, which had to do with this rare disease that emerged after World War I, having something to do with the influenza pandemic then, a post-encephalitic paralysis, which became known as stiff man syndrome. And people who are essentially frozen in place, and what we now know is it's an autoimmune disorder that targets something with the dopamine system. Sachs was a medical resident at the time, was at that point, the L-DOPA stuff was just coming out with Parkinson's, and Sachs was the one who had the insight to say, I bet the stiff man syndrome is a case of the most extreme severe Parkinson's that you could possibly get, and thus he was the first one to try L-DOPA on people with the syndrome, and thus you had miraculous awakenings, people moving voluntarily for the first time in decades. Totally amazing. But then you have a downside, and it's a downside that we know sort of the structure of by now. You got a problem with dopamine in the substantia nigra, lower than normal levels. Everywhere else in the brain, you've got normal levels. So you're trying to fix up this depletion, you give the person L-DOPA, but you're not spritzing it into their substantia nigra, you're putting it in their stomach or their bloodstream. You are raising dopamine levels in the substantia nigra and things get better, but you're also raising it everywhere else in the brain. And what you wind up seeing is if you give a Parkinsonian patient too much L-DOPA, they become psychotic. They are indistinguishable from a schizophrenic. And what was shown in the movie was this character played by Robert De Niro wound up having this florid paranoid psychosis from the L-DOPA. So, that being more evidence, you give a drug that raises dopamine levels throughout the brain and somebody starts acting schizophrenic. You give somebody a drug that causes very rapid dumping of dopamine, and they will transiently appear schizophrenic. What's the drug? That's what amphetamines do. And you get somebody come into an ER who...
Thank you. Thank you so much for the head pats, Joker. I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. Welcome in. I hope you're doing well. Oh, does Peanut need a pat? Oh, I must go pat him. Hold on. Thanks for redeeming the dog pats. Peanut most appreciates it. Oh yeah, and Mercy, I need to look up what Cobenfy acts on. I don't know off the top of my head. I will get back to you on that, I promise.
Is loose associations and hallucinating delusions and all of that, and most clinicians cannot tell whether this was somebody with an amphetamine psychosis or schizophrenia. Pump their stomach out. If they suddenly start making more sense, it was probably the amphetamines. So this being more evidence, now you should be thinking, what about the
Yeah, so that's kind of why we can get thought of as like meth heads or something, because because they experience psychosis from amphetamines. But thank you so much. Yes, so people on meth will behave psychotically like we will, but we're not on meth.
flip side? So you have schizophrenics where you give them these neuroleptic drugs to block dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex, as it turns out, but you're not injecting it straight in there, you're putting it in their guts, and now you got too much dopamine here, you lower its levels, but everywhere else it gets lower than normal, not dopamine levels, but dopamine signaling. And suddenly you should generate this prediction that if you over-medicate schizophrenics, they should start looking as if they have Parkinson's disease. And that's exactly what you see as well. A disorder called tardive dyskinesia, kinetics, body movement dyskinesia abnormal.
Yep, the body movement
and
disorders.
These are individuals who look Parkinsonian. Go into a state hospital, go into the back ward, and find somebody
there's
sitting
a back
there
ward
who's
for people with
tremoring like this all
psychosis.
over their body.
A lot of people have been to people with different mental disorders will talk about, like, the people in the front ward have depression, anxiety, eating disorders, OCD, but the back ward, everybody in the back ward is psychotic. So that's where I was.
Entire time, and that's somebody who is going to have been taking these drugs for 20, 25 years or so. So collectively, this winds up telling you all these different ways of suggesting the problem is that there is too much dopamine in this disease. However, just to make life miserable, there is at least one anti-schizophrenic drug out there which what it does is it increases dopamine signaling, and people get better. Bummer. Nobody knows what to make of this at this point. So what's the excess dopamine doing in there? It's not having anything to do with movement stuff, that's substantia nigra. It's not having anything to do with pleasure, that's dopamine in different parts of the brain. The best evidence is this is dopamine functioning in the frontal cortex, stimulating normal executive function. And what you got is a frontal cortex that is not making a whole lot of sense, loose associations, that seems to be where the dopamine problem is played out. Next neurotransmitter that's been implicated, serotonin. Look at the chemical structure of serotonin, and then look at the chemical structure of all of the major hallucinogens, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin. They are all structurally almost identical. And all of those hallucinogens fit into serotonin receptors and activate them. What is a hallucination induced by a drug? You've got some serotonin synapse where nothing's happening. The presynaptic neuron hasn't had anything interesting to say in weeks. It hasn't released any serotonin, but now there's something that kind of looks like serotonin percolating its way into the synapse where it could then bind to the serotonin receptors, and as far as this neuron thinks, it just got a message from there. And it didn't come from there. This neuron is hearing voices. And the fact that that's how the hallucinogens work immediately generated all sorts of hypotheses that there are abnormalities in serotonin and schizophrenia as well, having something to do with the hallucinations. Next, the neurotransmitter glutamate has also been implicated. What's the evidence there? When you take a drug that wildly stimulates one subtype of glutamate receptor, you begin to look a bit like a schizophrenic. What's the drug? PCP. angel dust, phencyclidine, that stimulates a subtype of glutamate receptors, and a lot of people have argued this has enough resemblance to what schizophrenia looks like that there has to be a glutamate problem going on in the disease. Very, very little bits of evidence for that. The one thing that has been shown in rats is when you stimulate the brain with PCP, what you get is an increased level of receptors for serotonin in some interesting parts of the brain, some kind of connection running around there. So very, very solid implication of dopamine, some serotonin thrown in there, glutamate, 11 other neurotransmitters that people are thinking about, but these are the main ones. And overwhelmingly, the dominant hypothesis remains the dopamine hypothesis. What about...
But again, the dopamine hypothesis only works for 2/3 of schizophrenics, which is still, it's a big number, but 1/3 of schizophrenics, we have no freaking idea. They don't respond to dopamine at all.
Brain metabolism. What's going on in the brain, for example, during a hallucination? And what you essentially get is wild activation of everywhere in the brain, and you're hallucinating. You get wild activation. People who, in imaging studies, have taken these drugs voluntarily, you get wild activation in the cortex, except for, say, the first couple of layers of the visual cortex, or the first couple of layers of the auditory cortex. What's that about? The cortex is seeing things and hearing things that did not come in from the outside world, that never stimulated the primary sensory cortex. Otherwise, during hallucinations, you see extremely high levels of metabolism throughout the brain. Next interesting thing in that realm, you give schizophrenics some standard declarative memory tasks, and metabolism in the hippocampus does not increase as much as in other individuals. So that brings us to structural features of the disease. Yeah?
Does the brain, while hallucinating, does the brain look somewhat like when dreaming?
Okay, good question. Does the brain, in terms of patterns of activation, look somewhat like during dreaming? Yeah. It's not the primary sensory cortex regions that activate. Frontal cortex is relatively quiet, and the rest of the brain is going like mad. And certainly makes sense. So structural stuff. There's all sorts of structural abnormalities in the brains of schizophrenics. How do you learn this, though? Very difficult, because for the first couple of decades in the field, it was all post-mortem analysis, which is you take out the brain of the schizophrenic and you go and look at it and you see if there's anything weird. So what's the problems with that? All sorts of things, which is to try to do post-mortem studies on human brains. Different brains sit for different lengths of time before they're autopsied and removed. So that's a huge piece of variability. Moreover, you can get post-mortem artifacts, which is to say they're pulling out the brain and somebody like squeezes it too hard and squishes something in here, and it's not going to look normal afterward, reflecting the handling of it. And out of that has come this whole world of neuropsychiatry types where what they live for are rapid autopsies. And a whole bunch of medical centers have rapid autopsy teams connected with their Alzheimer's folks, connected with some of the psychiatric diseases, where their idea is to get in there as fast as possible with patients who have, or whose family have, given permission for that, and get the brain out as fast as you can. And I remember a few years ago, I was down at Duke Medical Center, and they have one of these rapid autopsy SWAT teams, and they were bragging about how they were getting brains out in under 30 minutes from death. So that solves a whole lot of the post-mortem rotting away lag time. So all of those wind up being problems. More confounds. Very often you're trying to understand the brains of schizophrenics who have died, who are older, who are elderly. And the confound there is schizophrenics have horrible diets. You are seeing perhaps the brain consequences of malnutrition all those years, rather than seeing the consequences of the disease itself. Another problem that you've got is you get someone who's schizophrenic, and almost certainly what they have been doing for a long time is taking drugs for their schizophrenia. And if you see something different in the brain, Maybe it's due to the schizophrenia, or maybe it's due to the effect of the drugs. And
Yeah,
what
this is
that
a
has
common thought,
generated is the other thing
because
that
for me,
people in this business
a lot of my symptoms are related to the drugs too, so I have to treat those symptoms with additional drugs. But yes, there's certain symptoms that I would experience both when I'm I would experience
is killed for, which is unmedicated schizophrenics. And
oh yes, because people want to know about the medication. Yes. So sometimes my symptoms are from medication, and sometimes my symptoms are from schizophrenia, and you've got to suss those out so that you can take the least harmful medicines for your brain that also help you.
researchers love these people. They can't get enough of them. This is the teenager who was brought in and for the first diagnosis, and the family is no doubt thinking, finally we're going to get some help. And all the research or physician there is thinking is they want to centrifuge this kid and do research and find that out, getting unmedicated schizophrenics. Finally, a big boon in the field has been brain imaging. So instead of trying to figure out the normal size of things after you've taken the brain out, you could image the brain in situ while the person is still alive. Okay, so given all of those methodological constraints, there's a number of things that have come up. Here's a cross-section of the brain, although I'm realizing this is a cross-section of a rat brain, and it also is an amusing face. And what you have are these things that run through the brain called the ventricles. They are these caverns running through, filled with cerebral spinal fluid. What you see in schizophrenia is enlargement of the ventricles. So the ventricles enlarge, the skull isn't going anywhere, and thus if the ventricles are getting bigger, something else has to be getting smaller. There is contraction, compression of the cortex. So you get cortical compression in schizophrenics. You get it particularly so in the frontal cortex. Aha, that's kind of interesting. Meanwhile, over in the hippocampus, what you have normally are these very characteristic cell fields where I just drew them wrong, neurons that are called pyramidal neurons that shockingly are pyramidally shaped. And what they have is they're organized in layers, and they send all of their projections off to the next cell layer that happens to be diamond shaped. And that's how it works. You look in the brains of schizophrenics post-mortem, and there's fewer hippocampal neurons, and there's some of them are facing the wrong way. They've been flipped over, they're sending projections where they're not supposed to. This is not going to make for a whole lot of solid sequential thought if you got neurons pointing in the wrong direction. So that's popped up in the literature. Then, of course, frontal cortex, where what's been seen is, in some studies, fewer neurons. In some studies, fewer glia. In some studies, fewer of both. What you see is also lower levels of a protein called reelin, and what reelin has to do is with cortical maturation. There's lower levels of it in the frontal cortex of schizophrenics. All of this begins to fit in this picture of you're not getting a normal final burst of frontal maturation, late adolescence, early adulthood. You're seeing a lot of problems there. What else? You also see a couple of other minor things. The thalamus tends to be atrophied. Nobody really knows what's going on. The sense is...
That's the other problem. Like he says, nobody really fully knows what's going on. They're just throwing things at the illness, but we really don't know what's going on.
Pointing in the wrong direction, frontal cortex that's getting compressed because it's got fewer neurons perhaps. This is not going to make for a normal brain. So now switching one box back, what about the genetics? And you'll notice this is one of our first topics where there's nothing been happening here in terms of endocrine effects, acute releasers, not terribly pertinent to this field. So what about genetics? Going back to all of our classic behavior genetics approaches, this has been the psychiatric disease where there was the first evidence for a genetic component to it. The twin studies, the Ketty adoption studies that we've heard all about, and what they have suggested was about 50% heritability for schizophrenia. And you're all over now what heritability means and what it doesn't mean. What you see within families is if you have an individual who has schizophrenia and they have an identical twin, the twin has a 50% chance of the disease. If they have a full sibling, about 25% chance of the disease. Half sibling, about 12%. Take a random person off the street, 1 to 2%. So there is a large genetic load. What you also see is in a higher than expected number of close relatives of schizophrenics are mild versions of thought disorder. And that's going to come in on Friday in a very interesting way. What this is saying right off the bat, it is not saying that all relatives of schizophrenics have these abnormalities, but they are occurring at a higher than expected rate. So that
Okay, yes, so there is high heritability for schizophrenia. I personally do not have a relative with the disease. A lot of people do, but I know Precosmos, if you guys see him on there, I think he has a relative with it. But yes, I don't have any relatives with the disorder, even though it's common.
Old classical behavior genetics. Now, jumping forward a decade's worth of technology, how about molecular approaches, the version of just getting genetic markers? Not identifying the gene itself, but you remember this approach by now, where you were finding a stretch of DNA, and inside that stretch is a gene that is very pertinent to whatever it is, and the folks with the disease have a different version than the other folks, but you don't yet know what the gene is or where it is. So using this marker technique, some of the first disease gene markers came out in the mid-'80s, late '80s for schizophrenia. And these were landmark studies, and everybody was incredibly excited about them. And these were really, really important. And there was a problem, which is somebody would isolate a marker for schizophrenia in an Amish population. People love studying the Amish for things like this because they've got big families, because they don't have a whole lot of substance abuse, because they have very healthy lifestyles, and most importantly, because Amish men who say they are the father of somebody or other are probably the father of the somebody or other. There's not a lot of messing around going on, and that's kind of helpful. You're trying to understand genetics, and if you don't even have the right person pegged as the father, that's going to make for some messy data. People love the Amish. People love inbred Icelandic fishing villages. These are all the folks who get studied, and in those years out came some of the first genetic markers. And the problem was each of the studies was getting a different marker, and nobody was coming up with any replication, a complete uninformative mess that was a major disappointment in the field.
Yeah, that's what they say about studies. Your study needs to be replicatable. If you reach a conclusion, somebody else should be able to do the exact same thing you did and come to the exact same answer. But the problem here, he's saying, is that that people were finding different things.
So very little happened in terms of the genetic marker approach. So it had to wait another decade or two, and now our current, more modern version, which is forget a genetic marker, what about actual genes? Are there genes that have been implicated in schizophrenia where there are abnormalities, where there are variances in it? It comes in 2 different flavors, 8 different flavors, our usual deal. We've already heard about one of these, which is variants in versions of this gene coding for this enzyme that degrades dopamine carries an association with schizophrenia. Nonetheless, very small effects. Interesting finding, and this was last year, these were 3 papers back-to-back in Science from 3 different groups, all of whom used a very contemporary technique for looking for genes, which is a SNP analysis. And it's really interesting, and not in a million years could I describe it clearly, but using this very state-of-the-art thing, they all had huge populations of schizophrenics, thousands of people in the study, great studies, and the amazing thing is they all found genetic abnormalities, and they all found one in common with a huge effect, which was very, very reassuring until you looked at the gene, which made no sense at all. All
Dojo
three of
40,
these
welcome
groups,
in.
superb scientists.
We're just getting through this lecture on schizophrenia and responding with some of our own experiences. What you been up to? Playing anything fun?
Reported that in schizophrenia, you have a higher than expected rate of abnormalities in genes of the major histocompatibility complex. What is that about? The human equivalent? Wait, we're back at pheromones and individual signatures in the immune system. What is this about? Nobody has a clue, but a remarkable consistency in these three studies. They all found abnormalities in these major histocompatibility genes that have to do with cell signatures and immune defenses, all of that, and these were big effects in all three studies. All the studies were done superbly. People are just beginning to digest that one. Nobody
Ooh, congrats on the new phone.
really has a very clear idea. Some other genes have popped up as having mutations or a lot of variants, where one particular variant is more associated with schizophrenia. And there's this one gene that's been found and replicated called DISC1. So what does DISC1 do? Nobody has a clue. And just showing how pathetic this whole finding is, what does DISC, D-I-S-C, stand for? Disrupted in schizophrenia 1. That sure tells you a lot about what's going on. Well, what happens in schizophrenia? You have abnormalities in genes that are abnormal in schizophrenia. Let's party. So you got DISC1, and people trying to figure out it's got something to do with second messengers. Nobody really knows. There's not a whole lot that has been happening in this field that counts as progress. Really frustrating.
Yeah, we've had
People
trouble. We
still
can't
need to
identify
make sense of this finding.
some of
One
these.
area, though, that's getting a lot of traction in the last few years goes back to one of our weird mutations from our macroevolution type lectures, that business of different numbers of copies of a gene. Macro mutations on that level, transposable events, gene duplications. A term we got back then is copy number variance. How many copies of particular genes? And the one thing that seems to be consistent is all sorts of genes in schizophrenia are popping up with abnormal numbers of.
Hey, Winter Nick, welcome in. Thanks so much, my friend. Thanks for the hug and the rose and the heart. Peanut says hi. Oh, thank you. Yay, iPads! And Peanut is here. Okay, we are just watching a video on a Stanford professor discussing schizophrenia and talking about our own experiences. Peanut is a very good boy. He's the best boy. Oh yes, but kind of what they're going through right now is that they're having trouble isolating genes to have a specific gene that causes schizophrenia.
Copies of the gene rather than abnormalities in the gene itself. So that's really exciting. What's unexciting is nobody's replicating which the duplications are, and most of the genes, nobody has a clue what they do. People are flailing other than seeing there's all sorts of different genetic abnormalities that are popping up. How can that be? How could they all be relevant to this disease? Back 1 hour, it's not a disease. It's a whole bunch of heterogeneous ones.
Yep, I
and there's
agree.
going to be
It's a
all
whole
sorts
bunch
of
of different
genetic
causes.
components to it. Okay. Now our next box, early experience. And what early experience immediately translates into is parenting style. What does schizophrenia have to do with parenting style? we will see shortly, which is my smooth way of trying to say that I just jumped a paragraph by accident. So of course, where we begin is looking at the role of early stress in life, because that's obviously where you have to begin discussing early experience and schizophrenia. It's that whole stress model thing. We already heard one version of it. The adolescent stressor takes the kid who's just barely holding on and dips him way down. Another version of it that should seem plenty logical to us by now, prenatal stress. People who were fetuses during the Dutch hunger winter have a higher than expected rate of schizophrenia. People who were fetuses during a huge famine in China, 1959 to 1961, higher incidence of schizophrenia. Rats, expose them prenatally to lots of glucocorticoids, and they wind up having elevated dopamine levels in their frontal cortex. Have mechanical trauma at birth trauma, brief hypoxia, any of those things, increased incidence of schizophrenia. This is very interesting. Back to our business, remember identical twins, they can either share one single placenta or have...
Sorry, ads are on their way. I will pause when the ad starts, and so that we can get this together. I'll just keep it paused right now. So, anybody in here, how's your day been going? Have you played any fun games or done anything interesting? I'm glad. All right, the ad is over. The ad is over. Life is okay again. There won't be another ad, I don't think, in this entire stream. I have it set to just once per hour. Beast of Reincarnation. While there are people that are slamming the heck out of it, there's other people saying that it's something really special. Like, Precosmos was saying it's like pretty special, the story. So I would like to look at that. Nisokusu, I think you are you subscribed? Maybe you do not get an ad. I'm not sure. At the stream top, it just said there was an ad. Spider-Man. Yes, my partner and I just rewatched the first 3 Spider-Man in the series, and also some Doctor Strange, a Doctor Strange one. So we are excited to be all prepped to go see the Spider-Man this week. I need to catch up on all my Marvel Universe stuff there, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the multiverse that's complicated. Let me know how you like Beast of Reincarnation. Again, there's people bashing it, but there's also people saying that it really is something special. So let me know what you think. All right, back to listening to Jeff.
2 of them, monochorionic or bichorionic. Monochorionic twins are more likely to share the trait of schizophrenia than bichorionic identical twins. Fetal environment, stuff's going on there. What else with that? You wind up seeing a lot of suggestions of interactions between the neurochemistry of stress and some of the abnormalities here. You know how this works. Somewhere lurking out there is a data set that's going to wind up looking like this: bad version of the gene, good version of the gene, more and more stressful of a developmental environment. It hasn't been identified yet, but it's got to be something like that, because everything's like that. So, leading us now, obviously, to discussing parenting style and schizophrenia. So, where does that come in? Take the best psychiatrists in the field, the titans, the grand poobahs in 1950, and they would know the exact answer, which is parenting style is the cause of schizophrenia. Abnormal
Not true.
parenting is the cause of schizophrenia. And out of this, of course, since in those days fathers did no parenting, what you were saying was abnormal mothering is the cause of schizophrenia. And the great term.
And this made it hard for my mom to accept that I had this illness, was because they were blaming mothers raising their child for their illness, which has turned out to be complete nonsense. And it's caused a lot of problems, again, like with me, that my mother doesn't believe it because she doesn't believe it because she's been a good mom. So it's not about having a bad mom.
That was used there was
Schizophrenic mother, yep.
Mothering style that generates schizophrenia. What was schizophrenic mothering about? Well, it depends on whose paper you're reading. But in general, what they tended to have were elements of conflicting emotional messages. Conflicting a double bind is the phrase that always ran through it. The mother gets their son 2 ties for his birthday. He puts one of them on. She says, "What's the matter? You don't like the other tie I got you?" Or at the more fundamental level, saying, "You never say you love me. You never say you love me. You never say, I love you. How can that mean anything to me when I just forced you to say that?" There's no winning. And in that view, what schizophrenia was about was raising a kid with distorted, contradictory, fragmented emotional demands from the schizophrenic mother, and out comes schizophrenia. Now, actually, by the early 50s, people in the field were feeling far more sort of broad in their thinking, recognizing this might be damaging, in fact, to women who were the mothers of schizophrenics, and a much more humane model came in, which was recognizing the possibility that fathers could screw kids up in the same way. What was more broadly called this double-bind theory of schizophrenia, it is caused by parenting. It is caused by particular parenting style. And then, in the early 50s, along came the very first drug for schizophrenia, the neuroleptics, the dopamine receptor blockers, and over the course of the next few years, 90% of the hospital beds in this country for psychiatric patients were emptied out, the first medication that effectively treated schizophrenia, and at that point, if one had any sort of capacity to face reality, all of the proponents of schizophrenic mothering should have been shocked and stopped in their feet at that point, saying, "My God, what have we done?" It's a biochemical disorder. It is not a disorder of mothers who are not competent mothers.
Yep.
And it is fascinating to read in the leading psychiatry journals from that time. You would get these editorials from grand old men in the field where they would be saying, "I have spent my whole life researching this disease. I have spent my life trying to fight this disease, which is hell."
Thank you for the head pat. It is much appreciated. Let me know how you doing, man. Work is boring. Sorry you're not getting enough sleep. Hope you can get a little rest over the weekend, maybe, Jojo?
Which tragically destroys lives. I've been trying to do the right thing. I've been trying to help people. Look what I've done instead. This realization that ran through the community that parenting style has nothing to do with it, and it's half a century's worth of mothers bringing in their late adolescent for the first diagnosis and being told, unfortunately, it's this nightmare of a disease. How could this have happened? Where does it come from? You caused it. You caused it with your mothering style. Endlessly during the period where modern biochemistry sweeps into psychiatry, over and over there are cases like this where the whole field has to stop and say, "My God, what have we done?" Telling people they caused it through some parenting style, something of that sort. It's a biochemical disorder. So this was a shocking finding at the time and transformed the field in terms of schizophrenogenic mothering going down the sink at that point. Nonetheless, there's an interesting literature showing abnormalities or oddities in the way communication works in the families of schizophrenics. And this is a field now that's called communication deviance. What you see is, on the average, among first-order relatives of schizophrenics, parents, siblings, immediate family, what you see is, on the average, an odd communicative style. You see a very fragmented sort of communicating, a very telescoped, sort of terse, broken phrase sort of style. This has been noted very often. Again, this is not what is seen in every close relative of schizophrenic, but higher than an expected rate. What you also see is all sorts of realms of, in a sense, private communication between schizophrenics and their close families. And the way this is shown is with things like, this was a classic version, you take schizophrenics and you show them like a bunch of, no, that's not what you do. You give them a Rorschach print, one of those ink symmetrical things that's just completely chaotic looking, and they look at it for a while, and then you put it into a stack of a dozen other ones, and you mix them up, and you give them to the parents of the individual, and the schizophrenic or the healthy control is now trying to describe to the parents which one they saw, how to find the correct one in there. Control healthy individuals sitting there trying to explain which Rorschach blot they saw, like no accuracy whatsoever. The schizophrenic starts saying, it looks like a butterfly with a Van Dyke beard and ears on fire, and the parents pull out the right one instantly. It works in the opposite direction as well, where the parents are the ones trying to describe the Rorschach test. It only works within families. The parents of a schizophrenic are no better than a chance when doing it with some.
So the Rorschach test is used to test for schizophrenia as well, but for me, I gave all the normal person within normal boundaries answers during the Rorschach test. So the Rorschach test did not work in my case to diagnose me.
Someone else's child of a schizophrenic, there seems to be this going on. Logical interpretation. This has nothing to do with the emergence of schizophrenia. This is an.
Hey Romans, I'm so sorry you're coming down with the flu. Reminds me I should probably get a flu shot. Dang. Hang in there. Please have lots of vitamin C. I want to give you lots of vitamin C chewies. They are good too. They taste like, it's like by Airborne, and they taste like orange candy. Eat a bunch of orange candy. Hope you feel better. And sorry you're going through this. Hope you've got somebody to help you through this suffering time. Oh, dang, Dojo, I'm sorry. Well, I'm glad your phone's working now that you've got the new setup.
Obvious compensation. You have a child, you have a sibling who is this thought disordered, and there's going to be a whole lot more adventurous communication in the family to try to compensate for it. Few other things in terms of early experience, and this is a whole other domain of the disease, which is being exposed to all sorts of infectious thingies. And this is a really interesting provocative literature floating around. There's a far higher than expected chance rate of schizophrenics whose mothers were exposed to a number of different viruses in third trimester of pregnancy. Some sort of perinatal stressor, pathogenic challenge to the system. When you look at the genomes of schizophrenics, they have a much higher than expected rate of viral DNA that has been inserted in there, things called retroviruses. The technical matters don't matter. The main thing is more evidence of higher exposure to viral pathogens. An elevated history of neonatal.
And that's something, it's just, hey, if bad things have happened to you, if you've had a really bad life, it increases your chance of schizophrenia, which would kind of make sense. Or your mom, like, abused substances when you were in the womb. So yes, having all sorts of bad things happen to you in the womb or in life, unfortunately, do increase your chances. And it's weird because a identical twin only has a 50% heritability with their other twin who has schizophrenia. So environment does play some part. We just don't know how much.
Viral infections. And then the coolest one of all, which has to do with a protozoan parasite, not a virus or a bacteria, but this protozoa called
Um, where I live, they have autism tests for adults. Um, Sometimes you have to wait a while to get in. But you may want, if you have a psychotic disorder like I do, for example, you'll want your psychiatrist to refer you to somebody that can give you tests for autism. And yeah, it's worth the diagnosis if you think you have it, because certain places in the U.S. have benefits for people who are autistic. So like we have a higher chance of ending up on the streets, but if you have a diagnosis of autism disability, you've got a higher chance of at least getting into a group home where you have a roof over your head.
Toxoplasma gondii. And not Gandhi in the Gandhian sense, but probably because it's even pronounced differently. Okay, how are you pronouncing it these days? Gandhi, because there's two I's at the end, which the old Mahatma never quite came up with, but this parasite manages to get more I's in there than he did, so it's Toxoplasma gondii, as everybody knows. Toxoplasma is interesting. It has this interesting life cycle. It reproduces in the gut of cats. It comes out in cat feces. Feces are eaten by rodents. Now in rodents, and Toxo's evolutionary challenge has been to figure out how to get rodents inside cat stomachs. And Toxo does this amazing thing, which my lab is doing some work on, including Patrick, and looking at the thing that Toxo does is it makes rats begin to like the smell of cats and to go up and check it out. And soon you are inside the stomach of the cat and completing Toxo's life cycle. How it does it is incredibly interesting and slowly emerging. So what's going on with Toxo in humans? People who are infected with Toxo have a higher than expected rate of mild neuropsychological disinhibition, a little bit of problems with frontal regulation of behavior, higher than expected rates of serious car accidents, higher than expected rates for the same degree of depression, of attempting suicide, a picture of a certain degree of impulsivity. Not big effects, but nonetheless it pops up there. But parallel with that, from day one, there's also been a literature showing that toxoplasma exposure increases the risk of schizophrenia. Individuals whose mothers were exposed to toxo during pregnancy, or looking at schizophrenic.
Just 1 second. Mr. Peanut wants to go to the kitchen where the chicken is, so I'm going to transport him. Okay, I am back. Peanut is gone to get chicken.
And looking in their blood and seeing higher than anticipated levels of antibodies against toxoplasma, evidence of this whole world of a connection between cats and schizophrenia, and all sorts of hints there. Very, very slowly emerging field. It is a real finding, and it is a well-replicated one. There's some connection there. So where does these genes having to do with immune function come in? Maybe this is pertinent to this world of viral correlates of schizophrenia, parasitic ones. Nobody knows. Finally, what have we got? This challenge that we're going to have with, when you read the depression chapter, all of that, is how do you put these pieces together? How do you put together adolescent stress with prenatal viruses, with enlarged ventricles, with funny genetic abnormalities here? There isn't a very good integrated model at this point to how to put the pieces together.
We're still pretty confused.
Not gotten that far. So we're talking about genetic abnormalities, blah, blah, all of that, and thus, you know, our final box has to be the evolution of schizophrenia. Where did schizophrenia evolve from? First sort of question you would ask is, well, do you see something like schizophrenia in other species? And you don't. You look at complex primates and you see things that look like depression. You see reactive depression. You see melancholia. You see in some cases depression so severe as to prove fatal. You don't see animals having loose associations with proverbs and concrete thought and delusions and hallucinations. Animals that start acting schizophrenic get eaten that evening. So there's not a whole lot of insight from the zoological world. There's not any animal precedents for schizophrenia. Okay, so how about in humans? How did schizophrenia evolve? We are now back to one of our first lectures. Why did giraffes have long necks? Because it's a good thing that allows them to pass on more copies of their genes, because it's an adaptive trait. By the rules of Darwin, schizophrenia is maladaptive. Schizophrenics have a lower reproductive rate than their unaffected siblings. By the math, that is thus a trait that should be being selected against. Yet, schizophrenia persists at this 1 to 2% in every culture out there. Historical records indicate things that convincingly sound like schizophrenia have been there forever, and thus one has to bring up a question that always lurks in a scenario like this, which is, are there circumstances where schizophrenia is in fact adaptive, where it is advantageous, where it increases one's reproductive success? The only domain where that has had any evidence at all in the literature is schizophrenics appear to have a lower incidence of certain types of cancers, in particular lung and throat, esophageal cancers, and that's after controlling for smoking rates, all of that. Not a big effect, but that causes people to mumble something about maybe schizophrenia was selected for its anti-cancer properties and the disease and balance selection, all of that. However, there is another possible adaptive thing that's lurking around in there, something which causes some of these traits to not only no longer be maladaptive, but to be wildly useful in certain contexts of human society. And what you'll see is it's not full-blown schizophrenia, it's the milder versions that you see in some of the relatives, and thus, just to give you a sense of where things are heading, we'll talk about that on Friday in the lecture on.
For more, please visit us at Stanford.
All right, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me to hear the Stanford professor. He had a lot of great points. I agree with a lot of what he said. And yes, if you guys relate to any of the experiences he talked about, please let us know. Thank you so much, Wraith, for sharing your experiences with psychosis. I would like to ask you guys in the future if you wouldn't mind if I start posting the chat with my video, or if you feel like the chat should be kept private because these are your private issues and you don't want people reading them. So let me know if what your thoughts are on that. And then in the meantime, let's check and see who's on. Okay, so not a lot of people I follow are on. So, do you guys have any recommendations? Okay, well maybe we'll figure out somebody rate another time. But again, thank you so much for everything. And have a good night.